before we start drafting our end of modules tomorrow, we are going to learn some ways that you can be more effective as you integrate your sources into your essay. We're first going to look at how the author of the exemplar essay integrated their evidence into one of the body paragraphs. So the original evidence from the source is right here. It says, curiously enough, it was Sir Ernest himself who rescued Holness. No doubt he was spending one of his usual wakeful nights, and so was up and out in an instant. First he saved Holness's sleeping bag, and then the man himself. So this is the evidence that was used to write this part of the end of module task exemplar about Shackleton. Take a moment to read that with your partner. So who is Ord Lees? And how does the author of the exemplar essay indicate who he is? Answer that question on your paper. Ord Lees is one of the men. I can see here they kind of just use a little introduction here that says one of the men, Ord Lees, describes the time and so on. All right, the second question. Underline the information in the Ord Lees quote that the author didn't include in his or her evidence. Would including those ideas have made the evidence stronger, or why not? Take a minute to answer that with your partner. So they didn't include this idea here that Shackleton had been awake. And this evidence would not have been relevant to what was happening. We didn't need to know what Shackleton was doing before he helped Holness. All we need to know is that Shackleton risked his life. Third question. Would the Ord Lees evidence be more effective as a quote? Answer that with your partner. See here, this is an example where a quote would not have been as effective as paraphrasing. We did not need all of the information, and we could shorten the idea just to keep the most relevant information. There's one more question here in the back, and this question is going to lead us into our elaboration, which I know has been a trickier part of this. So how does the elaboration of the Ord Lees evidence connect the research to the topic statement? First, why don't you and your partner underline and label the elaboration? Our elaboration is here. If Shackleton hadn't acted quickly, Holness would have been crushed to death by the ice. Did you label that correctly? Okay. So how does the elaboration of the Ord Lees evidence connect the research to the topic statement? So the evidence or the elaboration explains what would have happened if Shackleton hadn't been willing to risk his life. It shows how his risky choices were what saved a man's life, which is what the topic statement states. Or this part here is the topic statement. Okay. So I want us to write something down. You can write it down here. I think this is an important point that maybe we haven't talked about as much as we should have so far. The elaboration sentences show how the evidence connects to the topic statement. So that's the main job of the elaboration. The elaboration is explaining or showing how your evidence connects to the topic statement. We're going to have another opportunity now to practice that elaboration on handout 24A. This one's called Effective Evidence Integration. And on this handout, there's a lot of information here. We have the heading, we have the topic statement, we have the evidence that's going to be used, and we have the concluding statement. What's missing is the introduction of the source and then the elaboration. Before we get started on this, I want to add a few notes to your response journal for this section. So if you would get out a piece of notebook paper, grab mine. All right, to effectively and responsibly integrate sources, you should. Okay, before you write anything down, share with your partner and then type here. What is something you think you need to be sure to do when you're effectively and responsibly integrating sources? And one thing I hope that you remember is that you need to tell where your evidence comes from. And why it is connected to the topic. We're going to practice doing that today. You also need to make sure that you're only including relevant evidence. Pieces of evidence that are not relevant should be left out by using summarizing or paraphrasing. So you want to make sure that you paraphrase or summarize long or irrelevant ideas. And then finally, back to that idea about elaboration. You want to use elaboration to connect your evidence back to the topic statement. So on handout 24A, you're going to have an opportunity to really practice the first and the last one here. We're going to practice telling where our evidence came from, and then we're going to practice using elaboration. So you should be introducing your sources the first time you use them. I'm going to give you some ideas about how you can introduce your sources. And you're going to get to choose one of these ideas on this handout. I can start by saying blank, the author of blank. And then I would give my information. That's one way I can introduce my source. So here I could say Jennifer Armstrong, the author of Shipwreck at the Bottom of the World, and then I would go on with my evidence. I could also say blank, and that would be the author, is a blank. An author, are they a scientist? Are they a researcher who writes about blank? And then you would give your evidence. So I say Jennifer Armstrong is a researcher who writes about Shackleton's adventure. And then I could give my evidence here. A final one is I could say author blank writes that okay, so author Jennifer Armstrong writes that. So these are 3 different ways you can introduce your source. And you only need to do that the first time. Okay, so you need to choose one of those to introduce this evidence, and then you're going to need to write some elaboration, just 1 to 2 sentences that connects this evidence to this topic statement. Okay, so good luck with that. The other thing that we'll be doing is completing the elaboration portion on your handout 20B so that you are ready to draft your essay tomorrow.